Good day, everybody. I'm super excited to be joined by Ariana, and we're going to be talking about ingredient insetting. But before we get into that, Ariana, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Mel, for having me. I'm Ariana, the founder and CEO of Forested. We are an ingredient insets business, essentially a regenerative ingredients company. We serve somewhat of a one-stop shop for consumer brands where we help them get access to one directly sourced regenerative natural ingredients, things like bee products, essential oils, and butters. But basically, if you just imagine all the different natural ingredients that are in your food products and cosmetics products, that's us. And second, in addition to creating that access to direct sourcing, we also develop verifiable Scope 3 reductions credits that really represent the regenerative agricultural practices of the producers that we work with in East Africa. So I know I mentioned or kind of highlighted the work we do in the market, but the bulk of kind of where our efforts are, including where most team members are, is in the field in East Africa. So we're split between Ethiopia and Kenya, with some project work in Uganda as well. So that's what ingredient insets are, basically regenerative ingredients embedded with verifiable Scope 3 reductions credits associated with the regenerative agriculture impact.
Wow, that's a lot packed into a little time, but thank you for sharing a little bit about what Forested does. Maybe taking a step back, just for those that might not know, and I know we're going to get into ingredient insetting in a bunch more detail. When we talk about a carbon footprint, there's what we call three scopes. So there's scope one, scope two, and scope three. And when we talk about scope three, that's really talking about the supply chain or the value chain. And so when you have an organization, usually over 90% of a company's carbon footprint is that scope three. And so that's things like purchased goods and services, which is, the ingredients or the things that make a product that a company is selling. It could be things like transportation. It could be things like people commuting to an office. It's really anything that's outside of the energy produced or the energy used by the organization. And it has a huge environmental and carbon impact. And so being able to invest and think about things like ingredient insetting can have a huge impact. I also think it's really interesting that when we think about, whether it be cosmetic or food products, right, the natural ingredients that are going into them are generally agricultural. And we think about global, greenhouse gas emissions, a quarter of them are agriculture. And so there's a huge impact to be had when we think about things like insetting. So I'm really excited to dive into this a little bit further. I know that you gave like a super like maybe high level explanation or definition of ingredient insetting, but could you go into a little bit more detail into how we think about ingredient insetting or how, your team does?
Totally. And maybe just to give more context to that term ingredient inset. So
Yeah.
Forsted coined that, but it's really leveraging words that existed. So we're hoping to make it trendy. Hopefully we'll see more of it. But ingredient insets, what it does in comparison to when I think companies are talking about investing in insetting projects is the ingredient inset really tethers that insetting or carbon drawdown value coming from implementing different, regenerative agriculture and kind of other carbon drawdown activities in a value chains region, but really tethering that to the ingredient. And so I mentioned how we really want to be able to work with brands and say, hey, here's your container, or let's say 18 metric tons of beeswax for lipstick. It comes with X credits or units that represent the carbon, the metric tons of carbon sequestered and or removed.
I think that one thing that's really interesting about ingredient insetting is that instead of something like a carbon offset where you're taking the amount of carbon emissions that you're trying to reduce or remove after the fact and basically buying a credit or investing in a project to capture the number that you're looking at, this is investing beforehand to really try and minimize the carbon that will be released and there's a lot of co-benefits. So I guess maybe do you want to talk about the co-benefits of ingredient insetting?
Sure, sure. Yeah, so let me pause. When we introduce Forested as an ingredient insets business and talk a lot about insetting, one of the first questions we get is, Well, how would you define insetting? And normally what I say is the best way to define insetting is in comparison to offsetting. So offsetting is when a company will be purchasing carbon credits, normally referred to as voluntary carbon units, where they're supporting some sort of carbon removals project outside of their operation. So it's almost like let's say a fashion company who maybe their production operations sales are all in the USA, but them investing in a tree planting project in the Congo.
Yes.
So comparatively, insetting is when companies are actually reducing their carbon footprint, investing in carbon drawdown projects within their own value chains. And I would say one of it, maybe obvious, but insetting is really picking up with a lot of brands because it's not only actually getting to the root of the problem or the root of the source of where carbon emissions are coming from. And Mel, as you mentioned, over 90% in scope 3, but by investing in various insetting projects, which do a lot of good for the environment, but also kind of engage your stakeholders, you're actually buying a lot of stakeholder goodwill. And these are stakeholders who are in your supply chain, stakeholders like farmers, local, national government, your co-manufacturing or processing partners, your logistics partners. And so really ensuring that you're investing in projects that positively impact or even just require more collaboration with your supply chain stakeholders is really key to enabling greater supply chain resilience, which I know is a hot topic for a lot of corporates.
Yeah, excuse me, absolutely. And I think that it's a really amazing opportunity, to your point, to really not, when we think about goodwill, that can mean so many different things. But when we think about the most climate vulnerable, it's usually the people who are producing the fewest emissions, and it's usually the people at the beginning of the supply chain. So this really can offer them an opportunity to have potentially an income diversification or an alternative way of harvesting or producing a crop that they've done forever, but in a way that's managing and thinking about things like deforestation or biodiversity, and which is also obviously a really big hot topic. We talk about an ingredient inset. Is that just another name for regenerative agriculture? Because oftentimes what I've been seeing is that ingredient insets really focused on regen agriculture or on deforestation.
Yeah, I would say it's regenerative agriculture ingredients. And that insetting aspect kind of brings in the verifiable, kind of measured scope 3 reductions impact of regenerative agriculture. So we started off as a more kind of traditional sustainable ingredients company, and up until recently had been practicing different regenerative agricultural practices, which I can define a little bit later, and basically sharing that with our brand partners based off of principles. And I would say there are still a lot of brands who are really happy to engage and invest in regenerative agriculture supply chains without necessarily needing some of the more kind of carbon market typical verification, just given the costs of verification, which is a whole nother world. But yeah, so ingredient insets is regenerative agriculture ingredients, but accompanied by verifiable scope 3 reductions units. And I would say our history of moving from a sustainable and then a regenerative ingredients company to an ingredient insets business was really to service a need we saw in the market that was growing, where corporates wanted to be able to invest in regenerative agriculture for their supply chains, recognize that the cost is higher. And then in parallel, there's also this increasing real demand where monetary funds have been put aside to actually invest in carbon offsetting, and really kind of realizing that we could actually combine those sources and goals of different teams within corporates together so that it was kind of win-win for the corporate, but also win-win for farmers.
Absolutely. I think it's amazing what your team is doing, and I think seeing the opportunity on both ends of the market for farmers and also for corporates is really, a matchmakers almost in a sense service that you're offering, which is really cool. I also think that as we think about 40% of the world's land has been degraded since 2000, and we're seeing more and more extreme weather events. Really focusing in on regenerative agriculture, different ways of climate resilience, has a huge impact and opportunity given, the things that every community around the world is unfortunately experiencing given the effects of climate change. So I'm super curious if you could talk about how the work of Forested has really been instrumental in community-led conservation and restoration in East Africa.
Yeah. So the real inspiration behind Forested came about several years ago, kind of based off of the accumulated work I've been doing on the ground in East Africa, largely in Ethiopia, around building kind of and strengthening rural fragmented supply chains. With an NGO called TechnoServe, a lot of the work that we did was to make supply chains for corporates much more smallholder inclusive, increasingly focused on regeneration. And so, one thing to note about regenerative agriculture is that the practices of regenerative agriculture are very kind of contextual to the landscape you're in, the land use history, the community you'll be working with, kind of what is their capacity, what are their traditional cultural practices, and then finally specific to the value chain. And so what we define as important and critical, like regenerative interventions, say for honey production in coastal Kenya versus honey production in biosphere reserves in Ethiopia, is going to be a little bit different. And so when we work with communities, we get a baseline understanding of what are the current practices for that value chain, whether it's a shea butter or a castor oil or for coffee production. And we're able to actually pretty quickly identify, especially in partnership with local government stakeholders, the farmers themselves, local research institutes, and kind of identify that list of, and we try to keep it to like 3 to 5 kind of most materially impactful regenerative interventions. And so it takes a lot of kind of collaboration with the community to agree on those interventions and then to start practicing them. And so I'd say that's kind of the work we do on the regenerative agriculture side, the kind of technical expertise our team has in terms of how to process products more effectively and for higher quality.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I guess just to, close us out, I'd be curious if you had any advice for an individual, what kind of questions they can ask about ingredients or what they should be looking for if this is something that's important to them.
When it comes to customers being able to assess their ingredients, I think the market is still a little bit behind in terms of communicating the impact of their ingredients and where they're coming from. I would say a lot of brands are getting better at telling those stories, and also providing kind of like the verifiable claims. I also think that retailers have a role to play in working with brands that they showcase to kind of highlight the good work that they're doing. But yeah, I would say I wish there was a little bit more. I do see the market shifting, but I think what customers can also do is also just kind of like look at the ingredients at the back of the, back of the packaging. I would say not all brands, well, most brands are not putting where their source is, because I think a lot of brands are still working on enabling that transparency, which truly is a huge undertaking that does not happen overnight. And then looking out for brands who are investing in direct sourcing, which is really necessary if they want to be able to have an impact on suppliers like farmers, in places like East Africa. And I do think that those stories will be shown more over time as more brands invest in more direct sourcing initiatives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that it definitely is a challenge working on the brand side. I can attest to it, telling these stories, even if they exist and are really powerful, it's not as straightforward as one would hope for. But I do think that starting off with those tips, looking at the back, seeing what the ingredients are, and just remaining curious can go a super long way. But really, thank you for taking the time to talk about what Forested does and what ingredient insets are. I think that it really made the topic pretty interesting and easy to understand, and that's how we try and keep it cool and make climate accessible. So thank you, Ariana.
Thanks, Mel.